Good evening and welcome to the concluding session of this semester's SUPERONDA talks that have been organized in collaboration with Sebastian Moreau, Raphael Bach, and Archizoom. My name is Teresa Cheung, and I am a guest curator at Archizoom and also the academic coordinator of the first year architecture program here at the EPFL. Tonight's session will begin with presentations by each one of our guests, followed by a dialogue where you, the audience, will be invited to pose questions and topics either through the chat or directly posing your question, preferably with your camera on if possible. But I am really delighted to welcome this evening two individuals who in their own right have contributed so much to their communities and have posed to the world at large so many deeply fundamental questions that seem to have been forgotten or lost. Their reflections and practices often find convergences, complements, and supports within each other, and continue to hit a chord with those who seek alternative methods to act. Firstly, a very warm welcome to Starhawk, ecofeminist, witch, activist. Her Earth activist training with the really fantastic acronym, and we are quite fond of acronyms at the EPFL, of EAT, comes with the practice of permaculture as an antidote to environmental despair, alongside earth-based spirituality with political strategy and direct action. Her work continually brings us back to reflect upon what is sacred, and through spirituality and ritual, how we might envision the world in an alternative way, with the realization that the earth is capable of being bounteous and giving. Needless to say, all this with some magic, which she describes as the art of changing consciousness at will, which particularly touched me. I'm also very happy to welcome Isabelle Stengers, distinguished philosopher and historian of science and scientist, who has over the course of many years delved across numerous publications into the intricate and complex relationships between sciences, peoples, and natures. She has developed close intellectual associations with practitioners of various disciplines, as we can see this evening, scientific and otherwise, and her philosophical inquiry into how various bodies and fields, such as politics, economics, and science, not only shape and form the world we live in, but would, with a little envisioning, have the capacity to alter its course. To quote her directly, "I will life to go on." This evening's event will revolve around the book. I will.
Starhawk.
Sorry, my apologies. There we go. To quote Starhawk directly, "I will life to go on." This evening's event will revolve around the book Quel, monde, voulons-nous, which is Isabelle's translation of the second part of Starhawk's book, Webs of Power. So without further ado, I will first give the floor to Starhawk, and she will be immediately followed by Isabelle. Thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you to everybody who's worked so hard to put this together. I also want to start by giving some thanks for Isabelle's recovery from COVID-19. We were very, very worried about you, and I've been singing and praying for your healing, and glad to see you sort of back, as we say in the West, back in the saddle again. And also I want to acknowledge that where I'm speaking from right now, which is a place originally called Yelamu by the Ramaytush Ohlone people, who are the original peoples of this land. Today it's called San Francisco, and that there is a heritage here of indigenous people tending the land, caring for it for tens of thousands of years, and also a terrible heritage of exploitation and destruction of their culture. But also to say that the indigenous people are not gone, they're still here. They have returned in many ways and have been able to come back and do ceremonies here. after many, many years when that wasn't happening. And I find that very hopeful. I've actually just come back from being up in northern Minnesota, where a group of us we call 1,000 Grandmothers for Future Generations went to support a struggle there that's being waged by the Anishinaabe and Ojibwe people, the indigenous people of that land, where the energy company Enbridge, which is a Canadian multinational corporation, is trying to put a pipeline through that would carry tar sands oil, some of the dirtiest oil on the planet, underneath lakes, underneath 22 rivers, the headwaters of the Mississippi, sensitive wetlands, and the lakes in the areas where the indigenous people grow and harvest wild rice, which is their traditional way of life. So we went there to support the camps that are trying to stop the pipeline. And to me, it's a perfect example of kind of the whole global dilemma that we face right now. This conflict that ultimately goes back to a conflict of consciousness and worldview, where in one worldview, we have an earth that is alive, that's a living being, that has rights, where everything is seen as alive and speaking and infused with consciousness. And it's a world that's dynamic, that's filled with spirit, with forces that are seen and unseen, in which humans mediate the way that those forces play out and see themselves as connected and as related, literally as relatives, to all of the different parts of the community, which aren't just human, but also animal, plant, the lakes, the streams, the rivers, the earth itself. That's the indigenous worldview. That's also what I believe was the indigenous worldview in Europe as well as in North America and around the world. And it's a world which really values the integrity of those living systems beyond profit and beyond convenience. And that is juxtaposed against a very different worldview in which things are valued instrumentally. They're valued because of their utility for purely human ends. They're valued according to a measure of an abstract thing we call profit, and where this value of life and health and ecosystems and diversity and beauty is not put into the equation, is always sacrificed to those numbers on the balance sheet. And that worldview is very much bound up with a particular kind of power. In English, we have this word power, but I know in French you actually have both pouvoir and puissance. And in Spanish you have poder, which means to be able. It goes back to the Latin root that means potere, to be able to do something. The ability, the skill. Someone once defined power as the ability to make what you want happen. But when we think of power, we often think of a particular kind of power that I would call power over. The power when one person or one group of people can control the actions or the resources or impose violence on another group of people in order to get what they want. And that kind of power infuses all of our systems, from our government to our bureaucracies to our educational systems to our corporations, most of them are structured in a kind of top-down way, where your boss can hire you and fire you, but you can't hire or fire your boss. Where the policeman can shoot you, but you cannot defend yourself against the policeman, which is a particular issue here in the United States. There's a different kind of power I like to call power from within, that is closer to that root meaning of the word, that is about ability, about skill, also about, you could say, spiritual power or moral authority, the kind of power you feel when you stand up to injustice, or when you say something that's difficult to say to somebody that you need to say, or when you speak the truth, even if it's not to your advantage. The kind of power you might feel when you're dancing, or when you're actually designing a beautiful building, and that kind of power is not limited. If you have the power to create a beautiful home for somebody and design it, that doesn't take away my power to do that. I don't have much power to do that, but if I had it, in fact, I might learn something from you that would increase my power. And I think that kind of power is also rooted in that quality we call spirituality. The word spirit comes originally from the word that means breath, to take in, to take out. And it's a little different from what we think of as religion, which often involves a belief system, a dogma, a set of rules and things you should do and shouldn't do. Spirituality, to me, really goes back to that quality of breath. And when we think about breath, every time you breathe, you're actually taking the world in, literally, to your body, and allowing it to transform you, to give oxygen, which then gets spread through your bloodstream into every cell of your body, to allow it to burn food and nourish itself. And that breath becomes transformed and breathes out again as the carbon dioxide that the plants and the green things take in. So it's this incredible balance where the green things, the photosynthesizers, are creating oxygen, and the breathers are taking that oxygen, using it to burn food, giving off carbon dioxide. It's an amazing exchange, a cycle and a reciprocity. And to me, that goes to the heart of what I think of as spirituality, that it is about participating in the world, not separating yourself from the world, about acknowledging again on every level that we are interconnected and interrelated, and that we are always giving and receiving. And the health of the world really depends on that balance, on that reciprocity. So we are currently in this crisis where that balance has been disturbed. Disturbed because we have burned so many fossil fuels that we have taken the stored carbon from eons and eons and put it back into the atmosphere to tip that balance. It's disturbed because also our agricultural practices, especially over the last 50, 100 years, but the tilling of the soil and the exposure of it to air actually puts carbon back into the atmosphere. What makes soil alive and healthy is humus. It's soil organic carbon. And tilling it, turning it over, exposing it, that carbon mixes with the oxygen, oxidizes, and creates carbon dioxide. So, for example, there is a researcher, a Dr. Ratan Lal, who's at the University of Ohio in the United States at their Soil Carbon Institute, who says we have as much excess carbon in the atmosphere from the Dust Bowl in the 1930s, where massive amounts of soil blew away and eroded, as we do from every automobile ever invented. It's a staggering thing to think about, but in a funny way, it's also very hopeful, because what it's telling us is that the world's soils are carbon hungry. The degradation that we've done to the earth on so many levels, and the desertification that's going on, are also part of climate change. And that gives us a path to also addressing it. Obviously, we desperately need to stop using fossil fuels and shift over to renewable sources of energy. There's no question about that. But we also need to draw carbon out of the atmosphere. And that is hopeful, because we actually can do it in the way that nature has done it for hundreds of millions of years, using plants and building healthy soil. So when I think about the crisis of climate change, if I'm thinking about it as a crisis of consciousness, I think it's helpful not just to talk about carbon numbers, but to look at climate change as massive ecosystem degradation across the planet. And again, the hopeful aspect about that is what we need then to counter it is massive ecosystem regeneration. And the good news is we actually know how to do that. And there are some very exciting examples of how that has been done on a mass scale. One of them being the Loess Plateau in China. That's Loess. It's a particular kind of soil where they've restored an area the size of Belgium from absolute degradation back to health. There are areas in Africa. There's a wonderful project called the Chikukwe Project, where they've taken a whole region in Zimbabwe and organized the people there socially, as well as shifting their agricultural practices, and done restoration. There are many, many more that I could name. So again, to me, that is a dilemma we face. And again, being up north, standing with Indigenous people to support their struggles against the oil pipeline was very much, to me, a struggle of these two faces of consciousness. And I also want to acknowledge that around the world, Indigenous people are on the front lines of the struggle, and that a lot of the struggle involves taking the lands that they do have and the resources that they do have. And it's very, very important when we think about climate change to understand that it has to be rooted also in social justice and in support for the rights and the sovereignty of Indigenous people. So if we look at those two consciousnesses, one question is like, how did we get into this mess? Like, how did we lose this wonderful, health-giving, nurturing kind of awareness of interconnectedness to everything in the living world? And especially as people who are European or European heritage, like are we doomed? Is it our fault? Right? Is there any hope, anything we can feel pride in our heritage in a healthy way, not in a nationalistic way? How did Europe get to be what it is? And for me, this was a question in my life back in my 20s as I got involved in the feminist movement. One of the questions we were asking about religion and spirituality is, has it always been patriarchal? Has it always been male dominated? Was there ever anything else? And of course, we could look around and see there were many indigenous cultures where women had power in a different way, where roles were constructed very differently. But what about the roots of European history? There was a wonderful archaeologist named Maria Gimbutas who did some very key work in the 80s and 90s. She did 5 major excavations in Greece and the Balkans. And she also looked extensively at the record, at the material record, at a lot of the things that often other archaeologists weren't paying a lot of attention to, like little figurines and symbols and patterns. She was born in Lithuania in the 1920s and grew up there where people still carried on old pagan traditions like kissing the ground when they woke up in the morning, and having sacred trees that they made offerings to. And she spoke something like 20 different languages. She could read all the stuff coming out of Eastern Europe. And what she really identified was a strata in European culture before Christianity, long before that, before the Bronze Age and the era of chieftains and weapons, where the earliest farmers and the hunter-gatherers, again, had that kind of indigenous consciousness of understanding and worshiping, if you want to say worship, the life force and the patterns of the way it expressed itself in animals, in plants, in nature, in the living world. And that civilization was, she called it matricentric, not matriarchal. It wasn't women ruled in the way we think of this society as male ruled, but where women were a focus of power and of reverence and respect, and had held power in many, many ways. And that was challenged and was changed by the invasion of people from off the steppes of Western Asia, starting in around 3500 BCE and completing itself about 1500 BCE, where a much more warlike, aggressive, patriarchal sky god culture came in and either conquered the original peoples or forced them to change so much in response that original culture shifted very much from what it was. And you can actually see this if you look at the myths, if you look at the stories, you look at the symbols. It's a very interesting way of looking back at history and mythology and realizing that you can actually see these two different cultures at play with one another. If I had another 5 hours, I'd go into that more deeply, but I would recommend one of my early books, Truth or Dare, talks about that change in Sumer. Riane Eisler's book, The Chalice and the Blade, talks about that in Greece. So what happened was, from about the Bronze Age on, you get war as more and more the center of culture. And it's partly because people now could make weapons that were much more effective than the old stone axes. And also, I think partly because there were places in the world, for example, in Mesopotamia, where if you had a massive centralized organization, that you could benefit from it. You could grow more crops if you could irrigate the land, and to do that required massive, again, centralized planning and organizing, and often massive amounts of labor that could be provided by slaves and captives. And that was very different from older societies where even if you did have war fighting, it didn't really benefit you very much to conquer people and take over their land, because there just was a limit to how much you could produce to feed everybody. And so we get the beginnings of what we call civilization, right? Which becomes more and more centralized and more modeled on that power over. And as that happens, it tends to become more and more patriarchal. And I believe that's because patriarchy, that favoring of men and that assigning of certain values to men, the values of aggression and brute force and power, that's just the ideology that supports warfare. It's not that women can't fight, but to motivate men to fight, it's much easier to do that if you can relegate women to being the prizes of war, and if you make men so afraid of being seen as womanly and cowardly that they're willing to go out and, stand in front of a bunch of thundering chariots and get speared rather than run away, which is probably the human instinctual thing to do. And that created a legacy of cruelty, of conquest, of giant states and empires. And again, if we had days, we could go through the whole history of that. But I want to fast forward a little bit up into the medieval and the Renaissance times in Europe, because I think in medieval times, you still had a lot of that ancient indigenous consciousness in the ordinary people and the peasants. When you had Christianity was the religion of the elites and the official religion, but the ordinary peasants and country people often kept to their old ways and had their old healing traditions and their old folk festivals, their carnival, their folk dances, their folk music, their songs, their fairy tales. And again, you can look at those and you can see within them that a lot of that ancient sensibility is still there. It's just covered over and it's in a different form. And I know in Switzerland there were until recently, again, festivals and carnivals and masks and traditions that you can trace way, way back, almost to the beginning of time, that again are reflections of people's complex interrelationship with the natural world in both its beauty and its inspiration, and also that recognition of forces that are more powerful than us and might be scary and might be dangerous, but are mediated through things like dance and song and offerings, and through treating them as consciousness, as conscious entities. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was undergoing a massive shift in its economics and its culture and society that was built on that. And we tend to think of this as the Renaissance, the era of enlightenment. And in many ways it was. But part of that was a push away from the worldview, again, that saw things as being inherently sacred, inherently having their own being and their own consciousness. The landowners who had derived their wealth from the land and from the produce of the land, now were facing a tremendous inflation because of the gold that was coming in from the Americas, and that was extracted, with incredible brutality often from that land. And that had an impact of shifting the source of wealth away from land and the old relationships in the land to trade and to money and to the rise of capitalism. And capitalism requires an underclass. It only really works if there's a class of people that you can get to work for little or for free, so that you can extract the value of their labor and concentrate that and make that the material reward for those who have capital to invest. So capitalism kind of required a breaking of some of the old relationships with the land. For example, in England and Britain, and in France and other places, this was a time of enclosures, a time when land, which had always been a complex system of different rights and responsibilities, where the feudal lord might own the land, but the peasants might have the right to graze the pigs after harvest, or run their pigs in the forest to eat the acorns, or collect the down wood, or hunt. All of that became alienated into land becoming a commodity, so it could be enclosed and bought and sold, and the profit could be realized. And to do that required breaking people's relationships with the land. And that meant shifting that consciousness, that ancient consciousness of understanding that certain things are sacred and certain things should not be touched, should not be exploited. And so this new, you could say this new conspiracy theory was put forth by the church, beginning with the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum in 1484 by two Dominican monks, Kramer and Sprenger, that said all of this old stuff was connected to the worship of the devil, and women were particularly agents of this satanic worship, and it unleashed a persecution where women especially, but also men all across Europe for the next 300 years were at risk of being called witches, burned, tortured until they named other people. And you can look at that as a war on consciousness, as a war on this ancient understanding of the earth being alive and sacred. It's left us, I think, with a fear of that. And also, and I say this as someone living right now in the United States, where we are contending with a level of irrationality and conspiracy theories, and that really go directly back to those old witch persecutions. It's almost like the same propaganda being recycled again and again and again, and the anti-Semitism and all of those things. And it's kind of staggering that we're now in 2021 and we still have people who are willing to believe things completely outside the realm of any kind of verifiable reality. But I think that's partly because this 400-year war on that consciousness has left people without the skills of being able to discern how to tell truth from falsehood once you open up to the possibility that there is a world beyond what is strictly measurable. So I want to just close this off by saying a couple things of what I mean when I say something is sacred. Because we often think of sacred as believing in something we can't see, some spirit, some force. But to me, understanding the world as sacred is not about belief, it's about experience. It's about how we emotionally experience the things that we can see. So if I go out into the forest and I see a leaf falling from a tree, and I know that that leaf will fall to the ground and will be taken apart and feed beetles and worms and insects and microarthropods, and then taken down into a living matrix of soil that's alive with bacteria and fungi and all kinds of creatures that then take that leaf and turn it into the nutrients that the roots of the tree can take up, and it will actually feed the trees and feed the growth and the life of that tree. And some essence of it, some part of it will then bud out eventually and become a leaf again and take in energy from the sunlight and create form from that. If I understand that cycle and can approach it with awe and wonder and reverence, then saying that sacred means this is really important. This is something we should value. And the things that we do in terms of ritual or ceremony are all ways of saying this is something we should value. This is something we should pay attention to. And when we make that shift and think about it as our experience, as our attitude, not as our dogma, then there's no conflict between science and spirituality. The more science tells me about that cycle, the more amazing and the more awesome it is. And I can understand that and thrill to that and feel a deeper commitment to protect it, to take care of it. So for me, my spiritual practice, it's not so much about closing my eyes, meditating, focusing on my inner imagery. For me, it's about spending some time each day in nature, opening up, coming fully into my senses, watching, looking, listening, and understanding that nature is always giving us information. Nature is always speaking. And it's up to us to learn how to open our ears and open our eyes and listen. And I believe if we do that, that is as key to stopping the destruction as all the letters we write to public officials, all the demonstrations we do. All of those things are vitally important, but it's also vitally important for each of us to come into our own relationship with the natural world and with the human community that depends on that natural world for our life and for our abundance. All right, I think I've more than used my time, so I'm going to turn it over.
je me mets à parler tout de suite.
Yes, so thank you very much, Starhawk. Isabelle, I let you let you start.
J'ai appris de Starhawk et d'autres que il est bon de commencer une intervention en reconnaissant le lieu où on est, mais le lieu où je suis est très différent de la Californie. Nous ne connaissons plus ceux qui l'ont d'abord habité. C'est un lieu qui a été un lieu d'occupation successive, qui n'a jamais cessé de mémoire humaine. Il n'y a pas, avant l'indépendance de la Belgique, comment dirais-je, de temps où nous ne fûmes pas occupés. Et peut-être que rendre hommage à ce lieu, c'est rendre hommage à une tradition d'humour récalcitrant qui est peut-être le résultat de ce savoir-être occupé. Et peut-être que cet esprit du lieu, cet humour récalcitrant, on ne peut pas dire beaucoup d'autres choses, qui nous aidera à résister à la haine qui nous menace, à la peur qui nous menace face à ce qui, comment dirais-je, qui est rejeté de manière infâme, c'est-à-dire l'arrivée parmi nous des descendants de ces peuples dont la colonisation européenne a détruit les mondes et que nous refusons comme, comment dirais-je, non civilisés, non intégrables, etc. Donc voilà, je voudrais rendre hommage à l'esprit de récalcitrance qui est le point d'espoir que j'ai dans le lieu où j'habite. Alors, je voudrais ici essayer de vous communiquer l'importance pour aujourd'hui de ce que j'ai appris. Ça remonte à une vingtaine d'années d'ailleurs, à la fin du siècle passé, en lisant ce premier livre de Starhawk que j'ai lu et qui est traduit aujourd'hui, c'est-à-dire Rêver l'obscur. Et je voudrais aborder ce point donc en parlant pour aujourd'hui de trois manières. D'abord, elle m'a appris et elle l'a dit, mais je vais le répéter avec mes mots, elle m'a appris à me situer dans l'histoire qui est la nôtre. On pourrait dire, comme elle l'a dit, comment est-ce que nous sommes dans what is this mess? C'est très important pour une philosophe d'ailleurs, parce que nous avons appris à honorer notre histoire comme celle de la raison. Le second point que j'aborderai, c'est celui de la volonté, qui m'a longtemps perturbée et que je crois pouvoir vous faire comprendre maintenant. On n'aime pas le volontarisme, mais la volonté, ça peut être autre chose. Et le troisième point, c'est cette nécessaire et plus vitale que jamais nécessaire, comment dirais-je, intelligence de la diversité dont nous avons besoin aujourd'hui. Alors, ce que j'ai appris de Starhawk, parce qu'au début, je me disais, mais pourquoi est-ce qu'elle se nomme sorcière? C'était ma première question qui fait qu'une amie m'a dit, bah, achète son livre, tu verras. Et j'ai vu. C'est que se nommer sorcière, c'est déjà une forme d'acte magique. D'acte magique au sens où cela transforme notre conscience. Cela transforme notre conscience parce que, justement, cela évoque non pas seulement ce que Starhawk vient de décrire, c'est-à-dire la chasse aux sorcières, dont les sorcières se veulent les sorcières se veulent les descendants de celles qui furent persécutées il y a des siècles, mais cela évoque aussi, et c'est ce que Starhawk dit dans une phrase qui m'a marquée, la fumée des des sorcières brûlées est toujours dans nos narines. C'est-à-dire, cette histoire, en effet, n'est pas une histoire que l'on peut renvoyer à un passé superstitieux où les gens croyaient à la magie. Non, la fumée des bûchers, c'est-à-dire la fumée des sorcières, c'est-à-dire aussi les inquisiteurs aujourd'hui, les descendants des inquisiteurs et les descendants des chasseurs de sorcières sont toujours parmi nous. Et ça veut dire donc que la peur est toujours parmi nous. La peur que la chasse aux sorcières a utilisée comme arme dans cette guerre des consciences est toujours parmi nous. Et là, tout à coup, ce qui nous situe, c'est, pour moi en tout cas, ça a été, mais au fond, dans mon expérience, je suis sans cesse confrontée à une raison polémique, à une raison agressive, à une raison qui traque les croyances, qui appelle d'ailleurs croyance ce qu'elle va traquer. Sa proie, ce sont les croyances, une raison prédatrice et une raison qui fait que si on se dit sorcière, on va inévitablement déclencher des rires de mépris. Ah, tu crois à la magie, toi? Donc, on risque la déchéance en se disant sorcière, et on le sait. Et donc, il s'agit de faire face à cette peur et de cesser de la laisser nous dominer. Et c'est en ça que c'est un acte magique, parce qu'on change sa position consciente et vécue face au danger, face à la peur. Donc, se dire sorcière ici, c'est comment dirais-je, accepter que nous avons un choix. En tout cas, ça a été ça pour moi, que nous avons un choix. Nous ne sommes pas simplement les descendants d'une civilisation telle qu'elle se présente, marquée par le progrès, par la libération par rapport aux croyances et aux superstitions. Si nous héritons de cela simplement et que nous fondons notre pensée là-dessus, nous sommes les descendants des chasseurs de sorcières, mais nous pouvons aussi prendre parti très difficilement pour les sorcières qui ont été détruites parce que nous ne savons pas qui elles étaient hors des paroles des inquisiteurs, mais nous pouvons, et il y a une très belle parole de Monica Wittig qui a été célèbre, je crois, en Californie, à l'époque où justement la question de cette déesse ressurgissait, où on a osé poser aussi la question Dieu était-il une femme? C'est pas pour ça que Wittig la disait, c'était autrement, mais elle a été reprise. Et elle dit notamment « Souviens-toi, et si tu ne peux pas te souvenir, invente ». Mais inventer, chez Starhawk et le groupe de sorcières que j'ai appris à connaître à travers elle, inventer, c'est pas arbitraire. Oh, on invente, on fait ce qu'on veut. Inventer, c'est expérimental. C'est-à-dire, c'est expérimenter avec l'efficace de rites qui, comment dirais-je, doivent revivre aujourd'hui, doivent ressurgir aujourd'hui dans un monde hostile qui a détruit cette tradition, et cette tradition doit pouvoir revenir. Comme disent-elles, la déesse revient, mais c'est à nous de la faire revenir, c'est à nous, elle ne nous sauvera pas, c'est à nous de la sauver. C'est une des paroles que j'ai retenues de Starhawk. Il ne s'agit pas d'une déesse providentielle qui nous récompensera, il s'agit de quelque chose d'autre, d'un pouvoir d'agir et de sentir que justement la peur a tué. J'en passe maintenant, et donc je crois que ce mode de situation est plus utile que jamais parce que, comme je le disais, la destruction de cette culture que Starhawk vient de nous décrire, qui implique le sens de la présence des autres et du vivant, etc., eh bien, cette destruction, elle continue. Elle a envahi à travers la colonisation le monde entier. La destruction a gagné le monde et elle continue aujourd'hui plus que jamais, jusqu'à nous mener au bord d'une destruction qui échappera à ceux qui croyaient pouvoir la manier. Et donc, deuxième point, pour un peu approcher ce que Starhawk m'a appris, c'est cette définition de l'art de la magie qu'elle donne, qu'elle propose. Elle dit, elle écrit, c'est l'art de changer la conscience, et puis elle dit at will. Et ça, j'ai aimé. On pourrait dire, c'est comme ça qu'on l'a traduit d'ailleurs, parce que à volonté, ça aurait vraiment fait volontariste et arbitraire. Je change de conscience à volonté, ça veut dire je peux changer si je veux, comme je veux. Et ça n'allait pas du tout, évidemment. C'est pas un art, c'est une arrogance ou une imprudence. Par contre, on a donc choisi en correspondance avec la volonté. Mais il fallait comprendre ce sens du mot volonté pour moi. Et je l'ai compris justement quand j'ai compris que cette volonté, et je le dis parce que je crois que cette compréhension est importante à partager, que cette volonté n'est pas ce que nous appelons du volontarisme du tout. Ce thème de la volonté, je l'ai compris à partir d'un extrait de son premier livre, La danse spirale, où elle médite sur comment ne pas être découragé par ce monde qui va mal, qui va de plus en plus mal. Est-ce que nous ne venons pas trop tard? Est-ce que nous sommes de taille? Est-ce que le langage qui a tué, le langage moderne qui a tué ces vieilles cultures n'est pas plus fort? Est-ce qu'il ne va pas détourner le sens de nos mots, etc. Donc, elle fait face au doute et elle se demande comment peut-on résister? Et elle dit, on aurait tendance à dire, nous croyons, ça, ce serait peut-être volontariste. Puis elle dit, non, c'est pas ça, c'est je veux que la vie continue. Je veux que la vie continue. Et je veux que la vie continue est un engagement. Et un engagement où la volonté se loge dans le fait de ne pas se laisser décourager, de ne pas se laisser détourner, de ne pas perdre de vue ce vouloir que la vie continue. Et il me semble qu'on retrouve cette idée dans quelque chose qui est un refrain, je crois, dans ses écrits, maintain the vision, maintenez la vision. Et maintenir la vision, c'est quelque chose qu'il faut comprendre au sens de laissez-vous nourrir par cette vision. Laissez-vous tenir. Tenez cette vision pour qu'elle vous tienne. Et de ce point de vue-là, je crois que l'histoire de ce collectif reclaiming dont Starhawk a été l'une des 4 créatrices, elles étaient 4 apparemment au début, j'ai compris, et qui depuis a essaimé à travers tous les États-Unis et en Europe, très peu francophones évidemment, parce que les francophones sont les descendants des inquisiteurs, ils appellent ça des cartes. Mais Descartes, c'est pas sa faute, hein, c'est le monde qui a porté Descartes et qui a fait le cartésianisme. C'est leur monde. Donc, cette histoire comment dirais-je, du groupe Reclaiming est, je crois, le premier exemple de ce que peut avoir signifié maintenir la vision. Elles l'ont maintenue. Et ça, c'est un contraste qu'il vaut de souligner parce que aujourd'hui que Starhawk commence à être reconnu par le monde francophone et par les activistes, elle vient sous l'étiquette écoféministe. Or, ce terme n'est pas vraiment présent dans ces textes. Et évidemment, elle fait partie du mouvement très important activiste auquel on a associé cette étiquette, que certains ont accepté, même revendiqué, d'autres moins. Enfin, mais c'est désormais devenu une étiquette globale. Bon, ce mouvement des années 80, où justement des femmes ont inventé une manière de faire face au désespoir, à la peur qui les saisissait, notamment face à la menace nucléaire en Europe. Ça a été surtout en Angleterre avec les folles de Greenham Commons, comme on les a appelées, et ont inventé des manières qui conjuguaient déjà le spirituel au sens d'art de changer de conscience et de tenir et de faire tenir devant soi et avec soi ce qui est sacré, la vie qui doit continuer. C'était déjà la défense de la vie menacée par la guerre atomique en l'occurrence, et en ont tiré une puissance d'invention, de manière d'intervenir, d'interrompre, de décontenancer les forces qui s'opposaient à elle. Mais voilà, l'écoféminisme, à la fin des années 80, au début des années 90, quand la guerre froide s'est attiédie, je ne dirais pas qu'il y a eu la paix, hein, mais attiédie, quand la menace a semblé s'éloigner, eh bien, l'écoféminisme, la vision qui portait l'écoféminisme n'a pas été maintenue, sauf par certains groupes comme le mouvement Reclaiming. Et l'écoféminisme est devenu la proie de quoi? Eh bien, me semble-t-il, de discussions académiques dominées par ces fameux inquisiteurs. La fumée des sorcières brûlées a vraiment envahi les narines. L'opposition entre matérialisme et spiritualisme a fait rage et a démembré ce qui s'était créé, ce qui avait été créé sur le mode de l'engagement activiste. Donc, je crois qu'il faut se souvenir de ça, il faut se souvenir de cette volonté de maintenir la vision et surtout éventuellement de savoir la défendre contre des théories, contre des idées abstraites qui réclament des comptes, qui réclament des légitimités et qui démembrent justement ce qui fait le sens de l'importance de cette rencontre entre lutte politique, pas politique politicienne, lutte politique et spiritualité, qui fait la force et l'inventivité de cette rencontre. Donc, maintenir la vision, c'est aussi défendre, comment dirais-je, défendre tout ce qui peut vous faire perdre de vue ce pourquoi vous vous êtes engagé. Et je dirais que le dernier livre traduit, il est ancien pour Starhawk, puisqu'elle l'a écrit au lendemain du grand moment des manifestations altermondialistes, disons-nous, en Europe, anti-globalisation, disent-ils, aux États-Unis. Eh bien, elle a écrit ce livre donc au début de ce siècle. Comment dirais-je, ce livre est rempli, est là pour aujourd'hui. Je voudrais que les activistes d'aujourd'hui lisent ce livre. Il est écrit pour eux parce que justement les problèmes restent les mêmes. ou se renouvellent. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, notamment, l'une des choses qui divise, ce n'est plus une théorie, les académiques se taisent beaucoup plus, mais ce sont des principes. Ce sont des principes comme par exemple le principe de non-violence. J'ai vu, et ça c'est l'horreur, hein, j'ai vu en Europe mouvements non-violents, des non-violents dénoncer à la police des fauteurs de troubles qui brisaient une vitrine ou cassaient un mobilier urbain, etc. Là, c'est exactement perdre de vue la vision. Starhawk, qui était à Gênes et qui a goûté le déchaînement de la violence dans les rues de Gênes, a écrit un texte splendide pour moi qui s'appelle « Pourquoi nous devons rester dans les rues » et où elle dit, comment dirais-je, elle-même non violente, qu'il s'agit d'un choix et non d'un principe moral à défendre. Et elle le répète et elle le travaille ici et elle écrit « Nous avons besoin des Black Blocs, nous avons besoin de leur rage ». Et dans son dernier livre, qui d'ailleurs faisait partie de la même génération d'écriture, elle écrit « Nous avons aussi besoin d'inventer une rage intelligente ». La rage peut devenir intelligente, mais elle ne le deviendra évidemment jamais si elle est dénoncée par les bien-pensants. Donc, je crois que cette rage intelligente passe aussi par une culture une culture difficile, comme toute culture qui doit renaître, de la diversité. Comment, et j'y reviendrai, mais comment aujourd'hui accueillir cette diversité sur un mode non moral, sur un mode intelligent, et n'oubliez pas que l'intelligence n'est pas une vertu morale. C'est une vertu, comment dirais-je, des opportunités. C'est un sens expérimental des opportunités. Donc, l'intelligence ne respecte pas les principes. Nous devons ça aux Grecs. Ulysse était l'intelligent par excellence, mais c'était aussi l'homme de la ruse, métis. Donc, quel type de ruses peuvent nous permettre d'honorer la diversité? Bien, j'ai l'impression qu'aujourd'hui, nous en avons plus besoin que jamais parce que la diversité est terriblement étendue, est extraordinairement étendue, parce que partout, au fond, aujourd'hui, c'est un peu décontenançant pour moi parce que je ne sais plus quoi écrire. Ce que j'ai appris de Starhawk et ce que j'avais essayé de comprendre aussi dans ma propre vie est repris par des voies multiples et sur des modes multiples. Par exemple, cette fameuse opposition entre l'exception humaine, l'homme et la nature, l'homme entreprenant et rationnel, en tout cas potentiellement quand il sera civilisé, et la nature soumise, eh bien, cette fameuse opposition, elle est battue en brèche sans que les académiques protestent. Au contraire, ils y mettent du leur. Certains en tout cas. Lors de la COP 21, vous avez probablement entendu le cri des activistes. Nous ne défendons pas la nature, nous sommes la nature qui se défend. Et ce cri-là, il affirme, il est empreint d'une spiritualité. Il ne peut pas être compris sans que l'on comprenne la puissance spirituelle de cette affirmation d'appartenance à la nature, c'est-à-dire aussi de ce sens du sacré, de ce que la nature, comment dirais-je, ce n'est plus la question de qu'est-ce qui est naturel et qu'est-ce qui n'est pas. La nature, c'est cette invention que reconnaissent les scientifiques désormais eux-mêmes, d'alliance, d'articulation, de générativité. J'aime ce mot générativité parce qu'on n'explique pas la générativité, la capacité de générer du nouveau ou de se régénérer. On la cultive, on essaye de la cultiver et la nature est pour moi, la grande générative. Et il y a là une rencontre entre les pratiques humaines et comment dirais-je, et les j'appellerais ça presque les pratiques de la nature, la manière dont la nature est une création qui se continue d'interdépendance toujours plus extraordinaire et que les scientifiques apprennent désormais à déchiffrer, comme Starhawk l'a dit, l'opposition. Je connais des biologistes qui étudient les interdépendances et qui reprennent ce mot qui dit le sacré à sa manière, qui n'est pas worship, c'est quelque chose qu'ils peuvent faire mais qu'ils ne font pas comme scientifiques, mais on ne peut pas comprendre l'invention d'interdépendance toujours plus inattendue et imbriquée sans, comment dirais-je, éprouver un sens du wonder, c'est-à-dire de l'étonnement émerveillé. Donc, les scientifiques eux-mêmes peuvent dire ce que les rites expérimentés par les sorcières néo-païennes essayaient notamment de rendre vécu, c'est-à-dire que nous sommes qui nous sommes, et c'est devenu un peu ma mantra, mon refrain, ma ritournelle, nous sommes qui nous sommes avec d'autres, grâce à d'autres et au risque des autres. Ça, c'est l'interdépendance. L'interdépendance n'est pas une belle harmonie, mais aussi une manière d'être exposé aux autres. Ne pas être autonome au sens d'autosuffisant. Et cela, je veux dire, les biologistes sont désormais en train de reprendre ce cri et de dire le ravage du monde, le ravage écologique du monde par l'extraction industrielle. De la même manière que désormais, de plus en plus d'anthropologues prennent le parti de la transformation que leur demande un véritable contact avec les peuples qui ont résisté à la modernisation et reconnaissent chez ces peuples une awareness, comme dit Starhawk, un sens vécu de, parce que le mot conscience en français, enfin moi j'envie les Anglais à cause du mot awareness, parce que justement c'est bien distinct de la conscience discursive et argumentative. Donc, ils reconnaissent chez eux une awareness dont la destruction a permis les ravages que nous avons commis. Donc, nous sommes dans un moment où il y a quelque part comment dirais-je, des cris qui résonnent partout et qui quelque part entretiennent la même vision et le même sens de ce que nous sommes issus d'un ravage écologique qui a ravagé à la fois les mondes naturels que l'on dit désormais plus qu'humains, mais aussi les mondes qu'on dirait humains au sens plus usuel, c'est-à-dire les mondes des expériences dont nous sommes capables et de nos modes d'être ensemble, de nos modes de création, de générer de la socialité. Donc, triple ravage, comme dirait, comme avait déjà dit Guattari d'ailleurs, qui n'avait pas lu Starhawk, triple ravage indissociable dont nous devons, comment dirais-je, dont nous devons nous guérir. Ce mot reclaim est un mot qui pour moi est merveilleux et qui ne peut être traduit en français par réappropriation que si on se souvient que approprier, ce n'est pas seulement prendre possession de, c'est aussi devenir propre à. C'est-à-dire se réapproprier un savoir, c'est devenir propre à cultiver ce savoir. Donc, la réappropriation n'est pas forcément l'expropriation d'un autre, mais le réapprentissage de ce que demande ce à quoi on se réapproprie, où l'on retrouve le sens du mot guérison que contient Reclaim, redevenir capable de ce dont la séparation et les ravages nous ont rendus incapables. Donc, ce sens que nous avons à guérir d'un ravage, peut-être avant qu'il ne soit trop tard, est, je crois, maintenant de plus en plus généralisé. Je ne dis pas qu'il est unanime, mais il n'épargne pas les divisions. Il se produit sur des modes divers et partout se pose la question de comment, que posait Starhawk à propos des Black Blocs, quel type d'alliance, quel type d'intelligence des alliances entre raisons divergentes de crier. Quand les activistes crient, ce n'est pas exactement le même cri que les biologistes. Comment fabriquer des alliances qu'on pourrait dire contre nature au sens de nos habitudes et de nos filiations. Starhawk, je crois, quand elle parle d'intelligence et que je dis oui, l'intelligence est rusée, nous oriente plutôt vers non pas une convergence des luttes qui demande beaucoup trop de bonne volonté et de soumission à un but qui aurait le pouvoir de nous unifier, mais éventuellement à la création, et là nous faisons bien partie de la nature, à la création de complicité, d'accointance, comment dirais-je, de complicité, on peut le dire, de connivence qui déjoue les anticipations de pouvoir qui jouent sur les divisions, qui anticipent les divisions. La division entre violent et non violent est une des grandes armes pour détruire des mouvements activistes. Donc, je pense qu'il faut penser ces divergences et les accepter et les honorer comme faisant partie de la situation aujourd'hui plutôt que de les regretter. Mais elles existent et pour moi, elles me taraudent. Elles sont un véritable problème. En tant qu'ancien prof d'UNIF, je sais et je vois et je connais une multitude d'étudiants qui quittent l'université découragés et dégoûtés par les savoirs qu'on leur apprend et leur non-pertinence absolue pour aujourd'hui, mais qui après se coupent de ce que ce savoir aurait pu leur permettre et dénoncent ceux qui, à l'université, tout à fait minoritaires, luttent pour d'autres types de savoirs. Quel pont peut-on faire qui fasse que les uns puissent aider les autres, que les privilèges dont bénéficient ceux qui restent à l'université puissent servir à ceux qui la désertent. De la même manière, quelles alliances entre ceux pour qui le mot travail est devenu synonyme d'exploitation de cette civilisation productiviste et les anciens mouvements ouvriers qui ont entretenu la fierté du travail et la lutte contre l'exploitation. Et de la même manière, comment dirais-je, comment créer des connivences inventives entre ceux qui ont fait, et je pense notamment à Notre-Dame-des-Landes, à préserver leur fidélité envers les lieux auxquels ils se sont attachés, et ceux qui ont refusé tout compromis avec l'État, qui est l'ennemi. il y a là comment dirais-je, un danger qui nous menace, qui est de nouveau la division, qui nous ferait perdre de vue la vision. Savoir honorer la vision pour la maintenir, c'est savoir apprendre, trouver peut-être les ressources génératives pour apprendre à dépasser ces divisions. Et les dépasser, c'est pas seulement, pour moi, pouvoir vaincre, comment dirais-je, avoir l'espoir de vaincre. Non, je crois que je ne suis pas sûre que ce à quoi la vision qu'il s'agit de maintenir, c'est la vie qui continue, la vie humaine et la vie terrestre en général. Et cette vie humaine va continuer. Et ce qu'il nous appartient de faire, me semble-t-il, c'est faire face à l'idée que nous pourrions être la génération, en tout cas la mienne, la plus haïe de l'histoire de cette humanité. Nous savions et nous n'avions rien fait. Donc, pour moi, maintenir la vie, que la vie continue, la volonté que la vie continue, c'est aussi pouvoir inventer des ressources qui pourraient avoir quelque valeur pour ceux qui viendront après, pour ceux qui devront affronter des drames, des catastrophes, des choix encore plus difficiles que ceux que nous avons à affronter, qui auront affaire à un monde dont le ravage se sera prolongé. Donc, pouvoir leur léguer quelque chose qui puisse être génératif pour eux, non pas qu'ils hériteraient avec reconnaissance, mais qui puisse leur servir, qui puisse faire une différence pour eux, je crois que c'est ce dont nous avons à répondre aujourd'hui pour que la vie continue. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Isabelle.
J'ai été trop longue, hein?
Pas du tout. On vous a écouté avec énormément d'attention, de patience. Effectivement, bon. I will switch in English, maybe.
Yes,
also,
and I do, because I can improvise better than...
But it has been such a wise and very thoughtful talks from Starhawk, from Isabelle now. So I think that we still have all this in our minds. It might be difficult to address directly questions, but from the audience. But of course, everybody is invited now to raise the hand or maybe write on the chat. You can do both. And I have to see the chat, yes. But we have, yes, let's take some time for a discussion between each other. I don't know if somebody has already a question. Right?
Maybe.
No, yes, Elena?
Oh, sorry, Elena.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe to start the discussion, I just wanted to come back to your last word, Starhawks, when you spoke about these daily rituals that you take in observing and embracing nature. And you really spoke about nature as something that was external to us, I felt. And I was just wondering, like, today we really try to avoid to have like this dualism, like to treat nature as something different than us and separate than us. And while you were concluding on like going into nature, I just wanted to ask you, like, what would be your definition of nature in relation to creating new relations with it?
Well, I think it's very true that we are part of nature and nature is not separate from us. But I also think that there's more to nature than just us. And so to me, it in terms of my daily meditation, it's really about focusing on the plants, on the weather, on the insects, on the animals, on the birds, on all those things that take me out of just my focus on myself and help me open up and focus on a wider world. And of course, it's when I'm lucky in that oftentimes when most of the time through COVID, I've been up on our land, which is out in the forest outside of San Francisco. When I'm in San Francisco, I have a beautiful garden, but there are times when nature might be looking at what's growing out of the cracks in the sidewalk, or just looking out the window and noticing what's happening in the sky. But there's always something that is there to focus on. And I think it's important for, I mean, it may not be so important for everyone, but for me at least, and I think for many people, we tend to be so egocentric and self-focused that it's good to just quiet that and focus on what's around us. You know, I'm a writer and also a fiction writer, so I can easily spend all my time lost in my own imagination. But my imagination is really enriched if I take in what's actually happening in the world around me.
So it really keeps you grounded.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Si je peux, if I may intervene, it seems to me that indeed the fact that we can claim that we are part of nature does not mean that we know how to connect with it, because we have been disconnected. So to learn again this awareness is something. So indeed, nature is not external to us. We know that. But to be aware of that is something completely different. Starhawk speaks about a great conversation in your book, the way nature, trees and birds and all that entertain a conversation. But in order to just be able to listen, and not even speaking of participating in, but to listen to this conversation is something we have to reclaim. So the exercise of being in is really not against being in is not a state. It's something we have to be able to become able again.
Thank you. I don't know if Sébastien, do you have a question?
Yeah, I don't have much time. So first thing, I just wanted to say how happy I am and moved also to see you both here. Maybe you noticed that we put on the poster 2 little drawings of you. You see that? They come from a huge timeline that we did in an exhibition on agriculture and architecture in Lisbon 2 years ago, and then in Lausanne, where we tried to portray the evolution of agriculture, architecture since the Neolithic. It was like a 60-meter long, huge wall. And on the last part, we had put a little constellation of persons, thinkers and activists that we thought were highly important to read and listen to in order precisely to build up the kind of awareness, or maybe we would say also wisdom, that we might need to cope with the situation we're into. And of course, you were both there among the little dozen of persons. So they come from that. Starhawk, what I think I remember you once defined, I think, your trajectory, saying from trancing with fairies to shoveling shit. So I'd like to go a bit on the shit side of it. I understand, and this is how I came to read you. That was my own way to your text. It was through permaculture thinker, because I understand that this has been also a whole thing for you, a kind of practical philosophy of dealing with situations. Could you say just a word for how permaculture links to this kind of laboratory of awareness that you have developed?
Yes, I started to learn about permaculture. I think it was in the late 80s when a friend of mine took a course, and I found it fascinating. Permaculture was coined as a term by two Australians, Bill Mollison and David Holmgren, back in the 70s. And they really developed a whole system of teaching, a system of ecological design. A lot of it focuses on food growing, some of it on building, but really ultimately it's about how do we design human systems so we can meet our needs and actually regenerate the environment around us. And, you know, I had been by that time a couple of decades on into doing witchy stuff and teaching spirituality and talking about the earth being sacred. I'd done a lot of activism around the earth being sacred. And permaculture seemed like the practical part of that. It's like, oh, I can sing about, you know, honoring the earth, but now I can actually go out and take a piece of damaged ground and I know what to do to restore it to health and bring it back to life. And, you know, whether that is growing a garden or setting up a compost toilet or setting up a compost toilet for a mobilization, you know, it has many practical aspects to it. But to me, again, those practical aspects are all part of honoring the sacredness of the earth and knowing what to do about it. Permaculture has three core ethics that are care for the earth, care for the people, and the third one, people frame it in a lot of different ways, but I like to think of it as care for the future, which means also about taking your fair share, reinvesting surpluses back into the system, and I think is inherently anti-capitalist because capitalism is all about extracting surpluses out of the system. And permaculture recognizes that any system, whether it's economic, whether it's the soil, whatever it is, it needs to be replenished. It needs those things to go back into it. So I spend a lot of time teaching permaculture. I've been able to teach in Europe quite a bit, although not last summer and not this summer, but hopefully in 2022, we'll be doing a course in Sweden. We did a social permaculture course 2 years ago in Switzerland, actually. And there's a lot of wonderful permaculture happening in Europe. It draws a lot on both traditional understanding, sort of traditional land management techniques and also indigenous land management, but it brings them together with science and with, you know, microbiology and other aspects of science and systems theory in, I think, a very unique way. So.
But I think that if Europe is activated in this concern, it may be an heritage of the opposition to the GMOs. Because there was an activation, including strong connection between scientists, activists, and peasants. The way we grow food became a political matter and quasi a spiritual matter, because something important was in the process of being destroyed, which connected with, or terminally destroyed, because it was already largely destroyed, but it was a final cut. So I think that indeed in Europe, permaculture has taken some kind of political importance and vital importance, which came from this resistance to the redefinition of what is the world.
Well, in Europe, you never completely lost all of your food traditions.
Well,
We did
not
in most,
completely. Yes.
as somebody who's eaten food on both sides of the Atlantic, I can tell you, right? In
Yeah.
Europe, it's better, right? And yeah, and that's really core to culture and to spirit, you know, and to ritual. Like so much of ritual focuses really around what you eat and the food.
But we lack land
Yeah.
compared to the US, which means that one of those people who cultivate back the land and in commons, not try to create commons and permaculture, but also social permaculture as associated with commoning. Well, they are struggling for some access to land.
Yeah. And at the same time, I mean, when I saw last time I was there, you know, we were teaching in Andalusia, and in the villages there, people were saying, like, you know, we have orange trees and we have no one to pick the fruit because everyone who has the land is aging and young people don't want to do this work. No one can get paid enough to make a living doing this work. And it's a worrisome situation, you know, where the villages and the actual agriculture and the people who do it are being depopulated. And at the same time, there are young people who want to do it, who have trouble getting access to land.
That's
Yeah.
a struggle. The access to land is something important today.
And here we have huge amounts of land, but we squander a lot of it. You know?
Yes.
The time is running, and maybe I want to ask if somebody else has a question to give the opportunity to raise your hand. Yeah, I think Abigail, do you want to ask your question directly? No? Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
thank you. Thank you very much for this very interesting, inspiring speeches, and just like one, maybe two general questions. You said like all the multiple aspects of the crisis nowadays, and first, do you have the feelings that you are more and more I don't know, like invited or here by different group of people more than before, knowing all your past as an activist in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And then if you have, you said you gave some advices, but if you have maybe one or two more advices on how to pick a fight nowadays. I can imagine it could be like a mix between skills and feelings and spirituality, but it's true that in facing all the different issues, it could be kind of difficult to find the right angle.
Well, I would say I'm not sure if I'm getting invited more or less, especially if this last year with COVID where nobody was going anywhere. But I would say in Europe, there's this renewed interest in ecofeminism, which is very gratifying to see happen. And in terms of picking a fight, I mean, I would say for architects, you are really on one of the front lines of climate change, because our energy use in buildings is a key place where we are using fossil fuels. So both developing your skills for creating a built environment that is less fossil fuel intensive in terms of the materials, in terms of the energy use to maintain those buildings, and then looking at the policies and the regulations, which sometimes get in the way of being able to actually do those things, and advocating for them. You know, as people who have the credentials of architecture, you'll be in a very good place to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I just related to architecture. I would have a question that for you, I really appreciate in your both your presentation how you don't want to put in your position beliefs and science, or you rather you really thinking very precisely how to create alliance. And Isabelle, you talk about alliance between activists and biologists. I think for this we can think about this book Silent Spring from Rachel Carson, who was really starting this this new connection. And I wonder if you have thought about maybe an alliance between this thinking about taking more care of the nature and thinking how we believe we belong to the nature, and the architecture and the construction and the city development, the growth of the cities, which goes also, architecture is building, but architecture has to destroy a lot also. You need to destroy, you need to cut trees. And there are always big discussion now about this. And a lot of some architects now, they really try to say that we should really stop to build. There is also a group of architects saying we have to do a moratoire on construction. So there is this worry about it. And because we are in a school of architecture, I wonder if you thought about this conflict that we could have in some destruction to build, and or is it more an alliance that can be created?
I think there definitely can be an alliance. I mean, in permaculture, we do a lot of natural building with earth and with cob, which is a mixture of clay and straw and sand, like adobe or like the ancient mud bricks, with natural materials. I think anything, creativity always goes with destruction. I mean, even if you're gardening, you know, or like I said, out here, in our community, we've spent a lot of time out in the, you know, where I live out in the country. This winter, we have had community work days every weekend, 2 days, you know, Saturdays and Sundays for months, just trying to get our land in better shape for fire. And that involves cutting trees and thinning and pruning, and creates an immense amount of material. So, you know, an alliance might look at what are these resources? Is there a way to use them in building? You know, we have a whole lot of a certain kind of pine planted in the 70s after a big fire went through, and it was really the wrong pine to plant in our area. It's not native and it's very fire prone, and it was put in to be nurse trees for the native plants and meant to be taken out after 20 years and never taken out. And now we have these big pine trees and we're like, what do we do with them? You know, we need to thin them and we need to take them out for the health of the land and fire prevention, but they aren't really that great for building or for anything else, you know. So thinking about those things, like how do we use the resources we have and we need in ways that are going to, again, create regeneration. I know there's a lot being done around materials. There are people who are using biochar, which is charcoal made in a special way that sequesters the carbon, that can be a very good additive to the soil to help increase fertility. But they're also putting it into plasters or putting it into cement. And so I think that idea of like we should stop everything comes out of the sort of a underlying assumption that human beings are a blight, you know, we're always a negative impact on the planet. But in permaculture, and I think also in many indigenous cultures, there's this understanding that as humans, we're supposed to be healers and make a positive impact. And that if we actually learn and listen and respect nature and understand how nature works, we have the capacity to do that. And I think architecture is a tremendous field of opportunity for looking into those things and doing that.
Thank you. I think we have Bharat who raised the hand. I will give you.
Hello. Hello, everybody. I was very pleased from Lisbon to see you again and to recover the memory of that fantastic exhibition and debate in Lisbon. And I was following, finally, I saw for the first time Isabelle Stengers, that I follow his books and his work and her work for many years. And I met finally Starhawk also. But I enjoyed very much your intervention. But I must confess that both interventions left me a feeling of defeat. I don't expect that you are a kind of oracle. It will the need and necessity that will drive architects and building techniques and old techniques or new old techniques to come together to face the problem. The problem is that I'm a descendant of an Indian chief living in Andalusia, and I want my car, a hybrid car probably, depleting carbon from the soil and from other places. I do want that. And so I don't know, I enjoyed very much your speech. I enjoy very much to read, and actually I respect very much, and I hope that permaculture will make its way. But I could not resist to tell you, and especially to the younger people that are listening to us, that my general feeling of your both talks was a kind of defeat. But I thank you.
Defeat? No, I would love to listen. Your car is very good, but how do you analyze this? What would you wait?
May I reply?
What do you wait? What are you waiting for?
I'm not waiting. I'm not waiting. I'm a strong believer in science. I don't enshrine the knowings that were important by the primitive people. I don't enshrine that.
You mean the defeat of reason and of scientific?
Yes, I believe in science.
Okay.
And in technology.
Okay, I understand. I better
and in
understand your idea.
And I'm very much anti-New Age attitude. So I want to express this clearly, which doesn't mean that I did enjoy many segments of what Starhawk told us. But again, I also enjoy many segments of Hamlet from Shakespeare. So,
Yes.
so it's. I hope that the EPFL and the architectural group and will take permaculture to a new level, to a new scientific and technological level.
May I
Yes, please
intervene here? It's interesting what you say here, because what do you mean when you say I hope science will take permaculture to another level? What do you mean by another level? Do you mean, do you want science to scale permaculture up?
Yes.
may I reply?
No,
do you want to do without attention, without paying attention, taking time and all that, and have rule to follow, scientifically grounded rules?
May I reply?
Sure.
Well, we live in a world. We saw this with the pandemics. We live in a world that a vast fraction of our civilized community is against vaccines, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what science has to do is not to grow into a large scale. Actually, you have to teach science to people. You have to educate people, and you have to reinforce the public sector. Science is important because it's the only way to have a decent society in the future. We must relearn the old techniques, and we must know what we depleted. And we must convince people from very young age that they should not want to have a big car polluting at the expense of the environment, the rest. And that's exactly what we don't see. Of course, the only practical thing that I saw in this debate is that the architects might, and I'm always astonished how late they are to use the new techniques and the new materials to incorporate in the new buildings. That I'm always astonished how late they do it.
Do you wish them to incorporate intelligent device where you do not have even to think to go and buy milk because the fridge does it for you?
Isabelle, this afternoon we did not have that debate.
Mm-hmm.
I would say
so, but I will
but
reply
that's
to
science
you.
too.
No,
that's
I don't
science
want.
Too.
No, I don't want. I don't want to. But it was not our debate today.
Yes, but okay. you turn it around science. There are many kinds of science. And we have to reclaim science.
We have to reclaim not only science, but the right and the need to inform and to cultivate people on scientific facts.
And I would agree with that.
And consequences. I don't want to have a kind of meeting around a fire, doing some magic dancing so that it will naturally rain. No, it's not that what I want.
If I can answer, you know, I mean, I do enjoy meeting around the fire and dancing so it will rain, but yeah, but that also doesn't mean that I'm very much also pro-science. I hope what I was saying was very clear, that I don't see that as being. Let me finish, because my Zoom it makes it hard for me to jump in if someone else is speaking. It has a little delay, but you know, we actually had a march for science a couple of years ago with Trump, you know, countering it, and had like a demonstration that was pro-science. And part of me was like walking along going like, why is this in like 2019? We have to be marching for science. Like, this is not like 1450, right? Where are we? And I think part of that is we have undone our education, at least in this country, really seriously over the last 20, 30 years, where we're not teaching science well, we're not teaching critical thinking. Everything is all about
True.
testing, testing.
Testing.
Yeah.
Testing, yes.
And the new age is a real mixture of things. You know,
Yes, it is.
it's been very split around the vaccines. You know, there are new age people who are anti-vaxxers, and there are others who are like, of course I want the vaccine. Like, this is great. Let's get it. We need it. It's not like there's one new age with one consensus about everything. There's some vast differences within that. And I've been a very vocal voice around saying, like, you know, we want to challenge science to say the quantifying of science doesn't describe the entire world. There's more to the world.
Yeah. Okay. Yes,
But
that I agree.
But that doesn't mean that we throw it out, you know, because obviously it works. You know, we're talking right now because of science and technology. And that, to me, that's a very good thing, that we can have this conversation, even if it's on Zoom, right?
Yes.
You know, the materials and the things that we use in the natural building have their place, but they're not going to completely rebuild the built environment. But they're worth looking at for what we can take from them and where. I mean, I think architecture at its best does this. You look at materials and you say, well, what is going to work best in this situation? And what, you know, are we going to take this old building and tear it down and cover it with concrete? Or are we going to preserve those beautiful old beams I can see behind Sebastian, because they're still holding the building up after, what, a couple 100 years maybe, right?
But I wish to add something, because really you annoy me. It's not a question of new. I mean, when you want to draw your cat, you say it's new age. No, I mean, science is its own best enemy in some circumstances. And one point already is that we say science as if there was a unity of science, a unity of rationality, while the good question is, in these circumstances, which kind of science do we need? Yes, we have happily the science to make vaccines. That's one of the strengths of the science. But the science of organizing a situation in such a way that a virus is not such a catastrophe. The science to help us answer this kind of, we are nowhere. Cuba did it. But it's not because of science, it's because the connection between medicine and the people.
I think that we are, it's almost 2 hours that we are talking, and so we should soon go to an end. Maybe I think, and I also have to say that I think Isabelle and Starhawk, that to me you are a real hope for science, and we are in a technological, in a scientific university here at EPFL, and I have to say that how you your discourse is bringing a really strong hope for continuing to do science. But maybe just before we end, we can ask Daniela Lopez. She raised her hand. Daniela, do you want to ask a question?
Yes.
Last question.
Hi, I'm so sorry. Thank you so much for the talk. I just came by train, so I'm a little bit in a rush. So I listened to the talk while I was seeing beautiful landscape. So it was super inspiring. Just to answer to the question before. So as a young architect, let's say, I just graduated last year. And yeah, so I did this project of my diploma about death. So it was about how to create buildings. Sorry, I just ran from the bus. So how to create buildings where there was this transformation from the humanization, which means to transform from the body into soil. And there was this very scientific part of the project, which I really had to explain how biologically we are in a certain way a matter like the plants and this, but it wasn't really enough, because as an architect, there is this cultural, let's say, aspect, because we build things for people in cities with a culture, with a story. And so the project was in Berlin. So there is also this story about that, of the World War, and all this concept of that science wasn't enough to justify my choices as a designer, because there was a concept that was very cultural and also very personal, that as an architect, for me, was very difficult to take a position, like say, okay, so my religion is this, so my belief in that is this. I could have done that, but I refused to do that. But then in my design process, I really had to integrate this cultural and this story, like with the nature. So that's just for the question before. As a young architect, so I believe in science, but it's not enough just to find every solution, because there are human aspects that go further than just A plus B equals C. I mean, yeah. So, so just to have this, my point of view as a young architect, recently graduated. So, yeah, and
thank you.
I'm sorry. And thank you so much for the talk. Actually, it was super inspiring. And yeah.
But it seems to me that your recognition of the human factor in place of science, well, what we lack, and some kind of architecture thrive on this lack, is the capacity of the docility of people to accept the kind of architecture they are offered. So the future of architecture, like many other things, depends on and some kind of science, but also rituals and empowerment practices and all that are needed in order for the milieu of architecture, for them to think in another way. They are the product of the docility of the people who cannot object. They are alone, like scientists. Science is what is science because people believe in science.
And I would also say that, I mean, one of the things that is really, really clear right now in our political situation here in the US is that the narrative and the story overrides the facts for many, many people. And that it's not enough just to present the science and the facts. It has to be embedded in a context that speaks to people and gives it a meaning that people can identify with, and speaks to the emotions as well as the intellect. And that is what's so challenging. But also, I think what we need to do in order to get people to change. And you wouldn't, it's really amazing to me that, again, we're in a point here in the US where not only science, but reality itself needs defending. Like, where just half of our politicians, are willing to simply ignore, like, the historic, like with the storming of the Capitol last January 6th, where they were there and their lives were in danger, and there's a video and you can see it, to turn around and just say, oh, they were tourists. It's like they believe that anything, you know, you just say something, you make it real. And they get away with it more than they should. I mean, you can't get away with that as an architect. As an architect, like if you aren't in touch with reality and you don't have a grasp on a certain level of science and physics, your building is simply not going to fall down. You know, it's not going to stand up. But as a politician, you seem to be able to. And in order to counter it, I think we really have to understand, again, that we have to counter it with story and with feeling, as well as with the facts.
And even when it concerns scientific facts, we have to demand well-constructed facts, because scientific facts are always isolated facts. From what? And with what consequences? So we can do a lot of things with fact. We have to care for fact and not to obey fact.
Thank you very much. I think now it's 2 hours that we are listening to you discussing with great pleasure. And it's really, I think, so useful for us. It was, as you said, the last of this series of 5 lectures on agriculture and architecture, and we could not have a best conclusion. I think it's a conclusion that opens up our imagination, our optimism, I think also. I don't know if, Sébastien, you want to add something, but I propose also as a closing word that we can ask Raphael prepare who can share the screen to show the drawing of where he put you, Isabelle and Starhawk, in the family of all the people who are thinking about agriculture and architecture. Yes.
I'm glad you put my hat on.
With your word.
What is interesting is I have no cigarettes.
Yeah. We can ask the illustrator to add the cigarettes. You're in good company.
Yeah.
No, yeah, just one thing. I'm really very, very happy of that last ronda, which was all about, I think, awareness, as you said, Isabelle. It's a debate about what is intelligence, and I don't know if you will share that, but I think I like the distinction that you have in English between wise and smart. And smart has now almost become the sure sign of everything which is badly unreasonable, right? Meaning solutions that you can scale up to any size, thinking that it would fit. That's smart in a way. You know, when you do that, it's smart because you can do it everywhere, regardless of the situation of everything. And it's exactly what technology is doing nowadays. And so if we have something to reclaim, maybe, it's wisdom, and we don't know what it is. I mean, we badly have to relearn from witches and many other people what wisdom might be like today. Yeah. And what I was really struck when I read and discovered these guys, David Holmgren and people like that, these are incredible philosophers. I mean, really among the most important philosophers of our time, I think, defining, you know, or approaching what wisdom might be like in a given situation. Yeah. Anyway, we could continue. And if I may add something, just, we all experience, I think, a kind of distinction between what we think and what we do. right? And I mean, at least I am in that situation, you know, what a kind of discrepancy between the two. And some people, and they are smart, I think, align what they think on what they do. You know, it's the easy way to become one again, you know. I want my car and I'll have it. You know, so I think it's not bad, you know, because I want it, and I'm not bad. So anyway.
And I have even the right to align it.
And then,
I am entitled.
And then you have the other way around, which is much rarer. Very few people do it, who try to align what they do on what they, to the best of their, you know, intelligence, think should be done. And this is wisdom for me. And it cannot be scaled up. It's in a given situation, how do I deal with that? How do I recognize all the interdependencies? How, I mean, I don't know. This was just what you made me think of.
And I guess permaculture way might be to look at it and say, well, all right, if people want cars, and we have had not much luck persuading people not to want cars, maybe what we should look at is what are the needs that those cars fulfill for people? And are there ways to fulfill those needs in ways that actually create regeneration rather than exploiting resources, or that exploit resources much less? You know, I mean, I grew up in Los Angeles. Deep inside, I love my car, right? But when I think about it, what I love is the freedom to go somewhere when I want to go somewhere. And maybe I believe we are creative enough as humans to be able to come up with other possible ways of meeting those needs, and recognizing that then it's a long process, you know, to shift that consciousness and shift that desire. But it rarely happens by telling people they're bad for wanting what they want. Yeah. And too much of the time in the environmental movement, I think we've been telling people the story that the world is in a mess and it's probably your fault and you're bad for wanting what you want. And I don't think that moves people. I think we need to be telling people the world is in a mess, but it could be in a beautiful place, and you have some unique gift to give to that process of change and transformation.
Thank you very much. I think that this could be a conclusion, if you agree, and that we should open our mic to clip clap. I think. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you a lot.
Thank you so much. And thank you all.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a good summer, Starhawk. Without fire.
Thank you. You too.
I think it's a good day for Starhawks and good evening for Isabelle.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bye.
Ciao.
Bye.
Thank you.